So I'm delighted to say that this evening we're joined by two wonderful contributors, Bishop Philip North and Reverend Canon Katherine Bagnall, and hopefully at some point by Dr. John Wallace. So let me first of all introduce you to our speakers and our conversation partners for this evening. Reverend Canon Katherine Bagnall is the priest in charge of two Anglo-Catholic parishes in Sunderland, in Durham Diocese, where she's also currently the assistant archdeacon. I was recently visiting one of Catherine's churches and saw firsthand some of the wonderful work that they do within the community in Sunderland. Katherine has been actively involved in some of the church planting plans within Durham Diocese, not least through the Hope for All community project, which is working to fight poverty and isolation in the local community. And this includes a food bank, a really wonderful community shop and cafe, as well as hosting regular community groups that feed into the life of these two Catholic parishes. Katherine, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our other conversation partner this evening is Bishop Philip North, the Bishop of Blackburn. And this is the diocese where Bishop Philip was previously a suffragan bishop, the Bishop of Burnley. Bishop Philip, I found this out in doing the research to write your biography, has some roots in the Northeast himself, and in fact served a curacy in Sunderland at the parish that Katherine is currently serving at. So a really nice connection there to make. And Bishop Philip was later a vicar in Hartlepool. Bishop Philip is a member of the Archbishop's Task Group on Intentional Evangelism and has been a strong advocate for church renewal, particularly renewal which engages with the poorest members of our community. So Bishop Philip, thank you so much for joining us for our conversation this evening.
Thank you, good to be here.
Thanks Bishop Philip. And hopefully we'll, at some point, I think John Wallace is having some technical difficulties, but if John comes, John is a really wonderful scholar who has written a short book, Anglo-Catholic Church Planting, Can It Work? And the spoiler alert is that John thinks, yes, it can, which is why he's part of our conversation this evening. And John's book was published by Sacristy Press last year. John was previously the lay chair of his deanery synod for over 30 years and of his diocesan synod for the past 10 years. He's been a church warden twice, and he continues to actively minister as a layperson in his own Anglo-Catholic parish. So it'd be wonderful if John can join us to hear from him too. Bishop Philip, if it's okay, we'll start with you. And I think to begin our conversation, I'd just like to make an observation, which is there's been a huge amount of funding in the Church of England that has gone into starting new initiatives, focused on church planting. And very few of those, we know very few of those have been in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. We did a piece of research last year which looked at the new initiatives within 11 dioceses in the Church of England. And of the 900 new initiatives that we were looking at, only 5 of them were identified themselves as Anglo-Catholic, which is a staggering statistic if it's accurate. Bishop Philip, why do you think that might be the case, that this focus on new initiatives has not engaged the Anglo-Catholic tradition in quite the same way as other traditions in the Church of England?
I'm really puzzled by that data, because without any trouble whatsoever, in about 10 seconds, I identified way more than that just in this diocese, in the Diocese of Blackburn. And I think the reason the data is questionable is twofold. I mean, you're talking about new initiatives. The language usually used is the language of planting. And I think planting is slippery language. I've heard that phrase used of a kind of mega resource church into which £4 million has been raised, and the same expression used of a kind of, terminally messy church gathering. So I think, and the language of planting is language also I think many Catholics are slightly nervous of for various reasons. So I think that language is difficult to begin with. But then, of course, a second, perhaps even slippery definition is what is an Anglo-Catholic? And definitions of an Anglo-Catholic can range from, the ultra-pucker society parishes, however many of them there are, to anybody who likes to put some clothes on before they celebrate the Holy Communion service. And increasingly the central tradition of the Church of England is being lost and labelled as Anglo-Catholic. So I think we've got a double definition problem, which may explain partly your data there, Joshua. But I would say there's a lot more, certainly revitalizing and also planting and new congregations being set up in the Catholic tradition than often we think. But still, I'd have to say, not enough. And let me throw out a number of reasons why I think it isn't, why I think that might be, why Catholics are so much slower to engage in this than other traditions. The first is a lack of resourcing. So, I think it is true that the national church and dioceses have been much more likely to invest in plants and renewals from the evangelical tradition than they are from the Catholic tradition. And when you push them on that and ask why, they say there's no track record. But of course, it's hard to start a track record when you're not allowed to start, when it's very hard to prime the pump. Which moves us on to our second problem, which is we're almost undone by the Catholic bias to the poor. So if I think just for a moment about the parishes that are part of the Society of St Wilfrid and St Hilda, there's 400 of them. Of those 400, 90% are in the 20% most deprived parishes in the country. And the work that Katherine does in Sunderland is absolutely typical of this. Anglo-Catholics are disproportionately present in the poorest and most deprived parishes. And that makes any form of planting, revitalisation, experimentation difficult because there's a lack of resource. There's a lack of financial resource, but also there's a lack of leaders. There's a lack of human resource, which can make it really hard to get things off the ground. If I was being really honest, I think also there is a weakness in Catholics at the moment, a weakness in Catholic soteriology and a weakness in Catholic theology of evangelism. Some aspects of the Catholic movement, broadly speaking, drift towards a kind of universalism that makes effective evangelism quite hard to start out. And in some aspects of the Catholic, some parts of the Catholic world, evangelism, I think, is almost a dirty word. People use other language, like growing community, but are scared of actually inviting people into personal relationship with Jesus Christ. We know that kind of language should not be tribal or about a tradition. It's a feature of any renewal movement. There's been an emphasis on personal relationship with Jesus, and I think that's language that we've been quite nervous of in Catholic circles. And I think finally, there's a point here also perhaps about respectability.
Hi Josh, can you hear me? My camera doesn't seem to want to work at the moment.
John, great that you can join us. We're just hearing from Bishop Philip, and I'm glad that you're on the call, but I'll come to you in a moment. But great that you can be here, so thanks, John.
Okay, can I just make one final point and then I'll finish?
Yes, please do. Yes, please do.
Which is about respectability and unrespectability. It seems to me that unrespectability, marginalization within the church, is a fabulous motivator of planting and renewing churches. The heyday of Catholics starting new churches was, really before the war, 1920s and 1930s, when it was unrespectable in the establishment, but fashionable, particularly amongst the young. When the Catholic movement became respectable after the war, it lost that evangelistic endeavour. When the evangelical movement was unrespectable in the years after the war, 70s, 80s and so on, there's tremendous energy and movement. And I think there may be a question, as evangelicals become the establishment, a question of how they keep that evangelistic endeavour. So that's a few reasons I'd throw out. So I think there is a lot more planting and revitalisation going on, but there's some reasons there why I think possibly it isn't enough.
Yeah, and thank you, Bishop Philip. And like you, I have some questions about the data, which I think can't be an accurate representation of what's going on. I wonder if I could just follow up with one thing before I come to Katherine, which is this use of language. I think is a really important thing to focus on. Is what are we calling new initiatives, and where is the language preventing there being a conversation going on here? Do you think there is language that opens up more conversation than it closes? Do you think the language that Catholic traditions would find comfortable?
So in this diocese, the language we use is new congregations, starting new congregations. And we've seen across traditions, it's the multi-congregational model that's brought the most growth. And I think that's language that Bishop Jill Duff introduced to the diocese, and language that has been very including of all traditions. And we've seen large numbers of new congregations start up across traditions.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop Philip. And Katherine, if we could come to you, I wonder if you could unpack this theme of the language of planting for us. I know that having seen the work you've done firsthand, you're really actively involved in starting lots of new initiatives. When I saw you, I think you said under certain counts you might have 16 new worshipping communities within your parish alone. What do you make of the use of language here? Do you feel comfortable using the language of church planting to describe what you're doing?
Not entirely. So I think like Bishop Philip, it's one track and often seen much more as an evangelical kind of stance. I don't think that. So, for example, I had a conversation with somebody who did point out how many new worshipping communities we had, or church plants, or fresh expressions. And for me, that was about us simply doing our job. No. So in terms of having a Eucharist in a care home, that for me is not a church plant. But to follow the theme of gardening, I would feel more comfortable with like grafting. So it's about bringing people in, even if there are other branches or other communities and congregations, as Bishop Phillips alluded to grafting things into what's already there, rather than making them little standalones, which really often can become a bit unrooted in themselves.
And Katherine, what are you seeing emerge from those small grafts that are coming to fruition in your own context?
So there have been quite a few folks who've come and joined us because what we've been doing has just suddenly appealed to them for one reason or another. So I think the one that I told you about in St Thomas's in Pennywell was the fact that during the time that the church was open and absolutely chaotic because of the food bank and the cafe and the clothes bank and all of that going on at the same time, just at the other end of the church, without any doors between us, we were celebrating the Mass. And for some people that was not what they wanted to see, so they would simply turn their back, or they might come a bit later. But for a good number of folks, it was just a chance to see what we were doing, and even to question if they thought it was all a little bit odd and weird, really. But just to open the conversation, there's 100% more chance of them coming to any form of faith or understanding a relationship with Jesus if they're part of something or hearing something that's happening. And we found that it was just a very gradual move towards them sometimes joining us, until eventually we ended up with often between 25 and 30 people for a Eucharist at midday on a Wednesday, most of them who have never been in church before.
Yeah, thank you, Katherine. Really fruitful examples of this lived out in context, and I think there's lots to be learned in asking those questions of where those things are connected. I was actually just using you as an example this morning in my mission class when I was talking about actually some of our kind of obsession with language betrays the fact that actually some of this is just about doing mission, the church doing mission faithfully. And I think that it's really powerful to hear those stories. John, I wonder if we might come to you. I don't know if you can hear us okay. But
I can hear you. I can see you, but I don't think you can see me.
No, we can't. But that's fine, John. We can hear you fine.
I've been struggling since 7 o'clock to get this wretched Teams thing to work. So,
well, it's great to have you, John. And one of the things that we have there's a question in our chat which I think brings you into this conversation very nicely, John. The question asks about what we learn from the legacy and the history of Anglo-Catholicism. I know this is something you explore in detail in your book, but what do you think we learn by looking back from the movement of Anglo-Catholic church planters, John?
I would think it's part of it's to do with vision, part of it's to do with a desire for mission, to get out of the rut, if you like, and to see that the gospel is for everyone. It's not rocket science. I just think the historic Anglo-Catholics, like the historic evangelicals, I think Bishop Philip was hinting at, saw a way forward out of the sort of late 18th century quite dull bit of church, and so it's vision. What did I also write something out? It's vision, it's mission, it's risk. Risk is probably the biggest thing. We have to take risks as a gospel, as you read in the New Testament. So those are the sort of things which, was it Ed, I think, who put the question up, was asking about. And I think risk is really important. If you look at the people, you know, if you look at the people in my book, Father Temple West was mad. A really mad Anglo-Catholic. I don't think we could cope with him today. But he took a risk to go from the comfortable bits of All Saints Margaret Street to the grotty slum alongside the Grand Union Canal just outside Paddington Station and build this enormous barn of a church. And that was a great risk. And his risk was supported by his vicar, who said, right, go on and do it. But risk and planning and determination.
Yeah, thank you, John. Bishop Philip, did you want to?
I was very intrigued how John there moved very quickly onto the building of a building. I was used to be in St Michael's, Camden, where the church planting strategy was, you know, you raised all the money you could find, you built the largest, most staggeringly beautiful building you possibly could, and that was the heart of the plant. And that is so different from church planting today. I'd just have to know from John how much the beauty of space, the building, the architecture, was integral to that 19th and 20th century planting movement.
John, did you catch that question?
It's certainly historically it was. There's a quote I've got, 1868 article quote. The London gin palaces were complete with internal decorations, abundantly polished metal in vivid colour. Ritualism is a sort of excursion on train every Sunday to bring the poor man out of his dull, squalid everyday life into a land of beauty, colour, light and song. So I think that is part of it, certainly historically in Anglo-Catholic planting.
It's interesting, isn't it, if you look at the we've seen in the past, particularly in the past 2 decades in the Church of England, a huge draw towards what you might call something like seeker-sensitive worship that tries to kind of meet people in a kind of common parlance, tries to bring worship into the language of people. And that strikes me as, in some ways, having the same motivation as the historic Anglo-Catholic tradition, which is that worship and mission are bound up together.
Yes.
But of course, what you've just articulated there, John, and which you often hear in some of the accounts of the slum priests, is that worship has a kind of transcendence to it, which takes us away from our ordinariness.
Yes.
And I wonder, this is a question to all of you, but I wonder to what extent do you think that is still the case today within the Anglo-Catholic tradition, that this sense of transcendence has a missional imperative to it?
I could come in, or Katherine maybe better as a practitioner.
Yeah,
sure. So for us, I think part of the issue that I have with looking at the sensitivities of seekers is that we've made an assumption that they can't really pick up what's going on, and we've also made a huge assumption that we can explain the mystery of God, and neither of those things are true. So for me, being able to offer something which is a great leveler for us, because as much as any theologian might understand something of God and the nature of God, we actually none of us understand all of it, and we only understand it as we've experienced it or heard about it or learned about it. So there's a great leveler in the fact that there's worship that shows God and demonstrates God and offers God, and takes away the personship of us in order to help see much more of God. And in that, I think the Catholic tradition is much clearer about keeping and sustaining the kind of worship that we have week in, week out, day in and day out, and people finding their way into it and finding their way into that mystery much deeper and into a personal relationship with Jesus, as Bishop Philip was saying, in order that we can then start to see a bit more of what that means for us on a human and personal engagement. But I think to be able to say we all understand this and we're going to just tell you how it is something of a fallacy, and much more about the person who's doing it than about the God who seeks to meet us in the Eucharist.
Yeah.
John, do you have any further reflections on that tension?
I'm just thinking my own congregation. I was preaching yesterday, so I could see them. And what we've found over the last, I don't know, couple of years, that we seem to be attracting lots of people with probably vague church backgrounds, and we live in a very fairly white-dominated parish, but now we are getting lots of people, I don't know where they're coming from various different ethnicities who want the sort of worship we offer. And even most of the people who come to us, they don't understand the theology, they don't understand historical bits, but they like they like the performance we put on. It does something to help them.
Yeah, Bishop Philip, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always struck by it may just be coincidence, it may be associative rather than causative, but the fact that the Catholic revival begins as the mines are sunk in this country, and decline begins as the mines close, and it's very much a kind of pit village culture. And I think a big part of that is the beauty of worship, the beauty of place. For people, when I was at Walsingham, the vast majority of pilgrims, 95% were from post-industrial parts of the country. And the beauty of the otherness of worship in contrast from the factory in the pit. I think we lost confidence in that for a while, but I can begin to see signs of us recovering confidence just in the beauty of what we offer. I was invited to preach in York last night at a church that, when I was a student in York, was run down and grotty and about to close. And I drove across the Pennines thinking, why on earth have I agreed to do this? What a stupid thing to do. To find a church with for 6:30 evensong and benediction, about 120 people in it, probably 60% under the age of 25. And really hungry for a kind of the full gospel, but also for this just then sense of beauty and of otherness and of transcendence. I think we need to recover our confidence in that, actually. And it's doing it in a way that is both beautiful but accessible. We often confuse what is mysterious with what is mystifying. There's no point in confusing people. We need to help people into the beauty of holiness. And look for appropriate ways to make it accessible, but not be afraid and not over-explain.
John.
I totally agree, Bishop. That's my experience. Right, we've got a beautiful 13th century Grade 1 listed building, so that does help. But I think it is important that we do this sort of beauty. We do this. We try not to be too wordy. I think one of the problems of the church today, especially perhaps the other end of the church from us, is it's all words. One of the churches I studied for my doctorate was in a school in Leicester, and the priest there said, I want to do something beautiful. It's a boring school hall. I want to do something there. So he has drapes and various other things just to bring some sort of beauty other than word, which, as we all know, the first 5 minutes you might take in, but after that you've lost it all. You've lost them all. And I think the beauty of holiness, the beauty of place is so important, particularly in our tradition. But I think it's important for everybody.
Thank you. Katherine, please.
So I appreciate the beauty of Walsingham, the beauty of ancient churches. So I've got two fairly modern churches and one that's a daughter church. So it's basically a community centre with a sanctuary. And I hope that people do find the beauty in that. So when I was asked to come in the days where we were asked to go and look at parishes, I was asked to come and look at it, and I walked in and felt like I was in an aircraft hangar. and thought, this is just not for me. I was used to beauty, I was used to old churches, and it felt very like it was just industrial, and I could not see myself there. And then the mass happened, and my eyes were fixed on the sort of huge crucifix behind the altar and the beauty of the simplicity of the surroundings.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's brick and it all looks like it points towards a kind of central point where it doesn't matter where you're sitting, you're looking at the altar. So we're not sitting in sort of distant rows. It feels inclusive. And there was just something so simple and so beautiful in that simplicity that meant, and nothing else distracted me from what was happening on the altar and from meeting Christ in the Eucharist. So for me, sometimes it's not about what we can put in place. So yes, there might be incense, there might be bells, and there will be vestments, but it isn't always about feeling that we've got to have the most beautiful building. Sometimes it's about feeling that we just have to have something that lets God speak, and lets God show something of himself in what we need to see.
And I think there is a drawback with beautiful buildings, that they become an end in themselves and almost become idols.
Yeah, well, anything can.
Yeah.
But I think it is easier with an older building.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katherine. And I think it's a really beautiful picture of as Phil says in the chat here, it's a really beautiful picture of the ordinary being made holy or being made beautiful. And I think there's something very profound about that. So thank you for providing that image. I wonder if we might shift slightly before I open up to some wider questions. I'm keen that we talk. Bishop Philip started by talking about focusing our attention on the poor. Let me just read you some words, if you don't mind me reading your own words back to you, Bishop Philip. Some words that you used at an evangelical festival some years ago, in which you said, we're all trying massively hard to renew the church. We're working like crazy, praying like mad. We're trying every new idea under the sun. But why does the longed for renewal not seem to come? I want to suggest the answer is quite straightforward. It's because we have forgotten the poor. Now, it was about 6 or 7 years ago, I think, that you made this, that you preached this sermon in which these words were used. Do you think we're starting to see signs of a shift towards engagement with the poor amongst church planting and church renewal?
I suppose in some ways, yes. I think since that, I mean, not because of me. It's it was. I think the Church of England sort of, occasionally recovers its priorities in this area. But I think estates ministry has become a thing over the last few years. I think increasingly resource churches are expected to plant onto estates or into urban areas. I think we're working towards a fairer national funding package towards churches in deprived areas, with the promise of increasing low income communities funding, with the national church investing more, quite well actually, into urban areas. I think there's a greater awareness of the need to develop a working class leadership. And some of you may have been aware of Alex Frost's motion at General Synod around that. But it is nothing like the kind of revolution that we need. In other parts of the world, church planting is the movement of, for, amongst the poor. And it just isn't in this country. We still have so far to go. I just think of Catherine's parish, actually. When I was a curate in that parish, there were 6 full-time stipendiary clergy. Last time I saw Katherine, she was on her own there. So we're still seeing way too much of a stripping back of resource in estates and urban areas of deprivation. And I just contrast that to the scriptures. A passage that always inspires me is Luke chapter 13, where Jesus steps into the synagogue and he goes straight to the margins. And he finds this woman bent over double with a disability, completely transforms her life. So in the end, she's standing up in the center of the synagogue, leading God's praises, absolutely at the heart of the community. And that's, I think, the vision that we need to recover, because if there's going to be a renewal of Christian life, which one day there will be in this country, it will come from the margins, and it will come from the most deprived and the most forgotten and the poorest. And that's where we need to be investing. We need our best leaders in our most deprived areas. We need to be planting back into those areas that we've left behind. We need a massive shift in resourcing from rich to poor. We need the courage for that scale of revolution, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Bishop, for that. Thank you. And it strikes me actually, Katherine, as someone on the forefront of this work, that is seriously engaging with the poor in Sunderland, and that you see some of the challenges of what this ministry looks like day to day. So Katherine, where do you think the need is if we want to see the kind of renewal that Bishop Philip's talking about?
I think part of what I've had to learn is how do they see themselves, really? Do they see themselves as poor? So in our communities, there's two distinct communities, and one of them is the poorest. But when you walk into it, it doesn't look like it's the poorest. The other one does. So it looks like the one that's the poorest doesn't feel like that, because they don't believe that they're poor, because they're largely an older population who have suddenly got state pension. And while that's not very much, and they haven't got money in the bank, and they don't own a house or a car or anything like that necessarily, they're not poor, because their physical assets, their money each month, is far more than they've ever had. So they don't identify themselves as poor. So to be able to minister and treat them in a way that's dignified for them is not to see them as poor, but rather to help them to see where they could be and where they are now as a great gift. So kind of what is the good news for them? And the good news for them is they're not poor, because they don't see themselves as that. And it might be statistically they are. But if we were to enforce that sense of we're helping this poor out of poverty, then we're putting something on them that they don't see of themselves. So the idea of being able to create things that they can join in, where they are deprived in terms of social isolation and things like that, that's the context in which we have to work there. On the converse, the other community, physically, emotionally, monetarily, and everything else, is definitely the poorer community, even if statistics say it isn't. And the reason statistics say it isn't is because we recently had to take in another parish, which is a village, and it automatically pushes all of the cuff scoring differently. So on paper, apparently, it's not as poor as it once was. Well, somebody needs to come and look at that and look at the community, and they'll see a very different answer to that. So for us, again, it's about finding out, I think, what the good news is in that place, and what their good news is, and where they're missing good news, where it's not so good, and how we can help feed into that. So for us, some of the people who have come to faith and are the most active in sharing their faith and have come through baptism, confirmation, and are then bringing people to faith or bringing their family to faith, or the people who are coming joining in those services or joining in the cafe and calling even the cafe church. I'm going to church. What they mean is they're coming for their lunch, but they're going to church as far as they're concerned, because they're finding something that we would identify as church. They're finding something of that being able to feel welcomed and a joy in us seeing them there and sharing life with them. And if they can do that and feel part of that, then the good news for them is they're in a place of feeling they're loved and cherished, and they'll come to. It's a very slow journey in most cases like this, so they'll eventually come to a faith. But for example, we did have one woman who has come to faith through just being part of cafe and sharing a story that, even having worked before I was ordained in schools and in child protection, is still the worst case of abuse I've ever encountered. But the love and the joy that she has discovered in Jesus, and the love and the joy that she now brings her grandchild to Mass on a Sunday and on a Wednesday, and she comes and volunteers and shares with us, having first met us because she came to the food bank. The joy in her is like the woman who was bent double, who was healed by Jesus, because she can just tell the story in the words of that community, and on the streets of that community in a way that we always can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Katherine, it strikes me in the way that you so beautifully described your ministry and the mission that you're doing. But I wonder, the question that's ringing in my head is what place is there for the kind of centralized vision and funding that we've seen in the church? Is that of any use to a parish like yours, where you're doing that work of showing up and being faithful to a community and to a people?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's easier with money, but it's not, the money's not that essential. So the way that the money helps us is we've been able to employ staff so that when we show up, and in communities like ours and many like it, things show up, people show up, but they don't stay. And the church has shown up since it was built there, and it has stayed, and it's been the one continuum. And people will still talk back to Bishop Philip will remember Father Patrick Kent many, many moons ago in that community. That's still the overriding joy of the men in that community, talking about a pub that no longer exists and a priest that no longer exists in this life, and having a pint with them most nights in the Eagle. That's the bit that the church did for them. That's the bit they still get. So being able to have money to make sure that there is always someone, not just something, and that we can show up and stay there, that's the critical thing really for us. So the money helps us in being able to employ people who can enable others and enable their ministries in order that they can reach the areas that one or two priests can't.
Yeah, thank you. There's some fascinating questions in the chat which I'm keen to get to. Let me perhaps just pose one last question to John, and then we'll open up the conversation more widely, if that's okay.
Yeah.
John, I'm intrigued as someone that has studied both historic Anglo-Catholic church plants and contemporary Anglo-Catholic church plants. What have you seen in this, particularly in this focus from Bishop Philip, that renewal will come by not forgetting the poor? Is that something that you're seeing in the studies of Anglo-Catholic church planters that you have focused on historically and in contemporary situations?
Certainly historically, I think that's the case. With all slum priests and all the various things like that in the churches which I studied, none of the three of them were actually posh churches at all, which I thought was important. One in West London was in the sort of 1930s housing, had a really mixed congregation. Probably, I wouldn't think a lot of them were poor. There were quite a lot of professionals who were passing through, very multi-ethnic, white multi-ethnic, which is an interesting thing. I met a Russian PhD student with his Moldovan partner, those sort of things will come to this Anglican church. The other one in London was much more in a poorer area, quite grotty housing around it, and the one in the other church in a school that was very much on quite a deprived housing estate. But I think the important thing is to realise that God works through all of us in whatever context we are. So, and we do get, the bit to the poor, the find out the good news to the poor. But certainly in my experience, there wasn't a lot of that. And I haven't had experience of churches like obviously Katherine has, with those sort of issues. So it's not really an area of my expertise, but certainly historically the Anglo-Catholics the posh Anglo-Catholics went to the grotty bits of London, to put it bluntly.
Thank you, John. And I do commend you John's book if you want to look at some of those case studies in more detail, a really wonderful resource. And there are lots of questions in the chat. If I might just kind of jump to a few of them. There were a couple of questions earlier in our conversation around growing in confidence. So Joshua Heath asks, how do we allow people to grow in confidence in participating in worship that is unfamiliar or unknown? How do we allow people to take that step? And similarly, Ed Stock asks about how do we encourage confidence in congregations to focus on growth and helping people to move over that barrier into the unknown. Any reflections from any of the three of you how we encourage that sense of confidence?
I think certainly the Anglo-Catholic tradition of Father says so tends to militate against that. But I think it's the role of the clergy and leaders in the church to get people involved, not so that they're not being done unto, they're being done with, and they're doing with. I think that's the problem with we have so many people who sit in church on Sunday, like I say, I saw them yesterday morning, who come on Sunday morning, take what we provide, but don't seem to give back much. And I think the whole gospel, Jesus' disciples joined in and the people joined in. And I think that's the important thing. We need to encourage people in whatever way, not by strong arming them or putting them on rotas the first day they stick their nose through the door. But we need to work lovingly to encourage people to say, this is your church, you are part of it, you are the church, not the vicar, not those of us who lead worship and whatever. You are the church and it's your part to play in it.
Yeah, thank you, John. Other thoughts or reflections on this question of practically how do we enable people to grow in confidence in participation?
Yeah, if I can add something, we had a series of services of masses in that service where we were on a Wednesday where it was a newer congregation and people were wanting to know a bit more. So one of our curates decided every time we did it, so every week we'd advertise that there would be something of teaching. So at the beginning of the service, he explained an element, and right from vesting and why he wore the vestments, why he wore them and what they represent, all the way through to each stage. And just a few minutes before each service started, he said something until we'd got from the beginning to the end, and then there was a little discussion group afterwards with kind of cake and coffee. And sometimes the discussion took the form of what we'd hoped in terms of what the mass was about, and sometimes it was just, it was really nice to see each other and have a chat. So for some of that, I think there are teaching elements to kind of keep the mystery, but not make it something that's not able to be understood. But also allowing, once I think that teaching had been done, it allowed people to enter into part of the mystery more deeply, because they weren't wondering why we were doing what we were doing and why we were saying what we were saying and where that bit actually comes from. Yes. And to see it all very scripturally laid out or held in the teachings of Jesus. And another curate spent one of our Bible studies going through, when we say things in the Eucharist, what we say and how that's connected to scripture. And for people who'd been there all of their lives, that was an entirely different group. It was people who largely had worshipped all of their lives, but had no real connection with why those things are said and what that refers us back to. So I think it is about finding out where people are and helping them at each level to enter into something where they can more deeply offer of themselves.
Yeah. Thank you, Katherine. I wonder if we might shift. There are lots of fascinating questions in the chat, which we probably don't have time for all of them. Bishop Philip, there's a wonderful question here from Katherine, who I take it is kind of picking up on this language of new congregations that you began talking about. And she asks, is it possible to keep a Eucharistic focus and to be one inclusive body of Christ if we go down a multi-congregational model? If we have lots of congregations, can we retain that oneness of gathering around the Eucharist?
Well, yeah, because that's what exactly what the Eucharist does, isn't it? It gathers congregations from across the globe into one family in Christ. It's the Eucharist that makes us the church. I suspect what Katherine is getting at is that if you go for a multi-congregational model, you lose the sense of one family gathered around the altar. And there's quite a heated conversation amongst Catholics in the broader sense in this diocese on just exactly that. You know, for a long time, it's all about the family mass. You have one Sunday gathering, everyone goes to it. The trouble is, it doesn't work anymore. You know, there's so much else going on in people's lives. There's you know, if I'm a 12-year-old boy given the choice between going to mass or playing football, I'm going to play football, aren't I? That 12-year-old boy should not have to make that choice. Life is very different these days, and also the way people want to belong to a church is very different. And this is why I think, you know, having multiple congregations, maybe just of 15, 20 people, perhaps smaller than that, is growing the total size of a congregation. And, you know, for the priest, you don't get quite the same hit as preaching to a big crowd, but that shouldn't really be what it's about, should it? It's you know, I do think a Sunday morning Eucharistic gathering should be the heart of any parish life. But if you've got that as the uniting point, I think you can then be tremendously experimental about other ways into the Christian life for people. And it just seems to work. That's, you know, a series of small congregations is a very effective method of drawing people into the Christian family. You know, to be a church, it needs to be sacramental, would be my starting point. So I suppose I'm thinking of separate sacramental gatherings or church with a strong Eucharistic dimension. So, for example, St. Lawrence Chorley. St. Lawrence Chorley, you know, it's one Sunday service, got about 80 people. Lockdown happened. They had to have several congregations. They kept it up. They now have a Saturday night vigil Eucharist aimed at families at 5 o'clock, which is Eucharistic, but very informally done, simple teaching, range of musical styles, hot chocolate afterwards. They then have 2 services on a Sunday morning, one said, more traditional, one sung. Those 3 congregations mean they've doubled, but they're all Eucharistic, but they've doubled the size of the congregation. But so that's really what I have in mind, really.
Certainly my experience in my parish, Bishop, we have most Sundays 3 services. We have the 8 o'clock, which is, as you say, very traditional. We have the main parish mass, and then we have a messy mass or all age worship as well later on in the morning. 3 distinct congregations, not a lot of crossover, but a lot of people come to mass.
I wonder if I might just ask the kind of elephant in the room regarding the Eucharist and church planting, which is the question of vocations. As somebody that teaches in a theological college, one of the things that is just very evident is that there are far fewer people training for ordained ministry, and a lot of the conversation around new worshipping communities is around enabling lay people, which is a big challenge in a very Eucharistic tradition. I wonder if you have reflections on either the question around how we enable more vocations, but also what do we do if the vocations numbers don't pick up and actually we don't have enough people to preside at the Eucharist.
That calls to pause, and I hate a silence, though Katherine is much better placed to answer this one, as indeed most of us. So, Katherine, I'm going to try and draw you out.
Yeah, good.
As opposed to a bishop being more organised on this one. Okay, let's go. So I think it's both and. I think that helping lay people to take their place is essential and critical to all that we're doing as church. There are some things that they can't do, that because the Church of England is as it is, and I think that's right. And so I'm very happy for lay people to be very involved, but make no apology for the bits that they can't do. I think having done that a number of times with lay people, there are some who have found the courage to take a step further and have come to ordination. So we have 2 priests who are in our parish who were both raised up from our parish and who have come to a point in their ministries of having the courage. So one had been a reader for many years and eventually was encouraged to take that step further. Another person relatively new to faith, began to just say, I might be an APA. I think God might be asking me to do this, till eventually we got to reader training, and that's as far as she could see herself. And eventually, at the point of being licensed as a reader, said, actually, I think I'm going to have to own up to the fact that God's calling me to be a priest. And so I think for some people, that there has to be those little steps, and often that is in poorer communities where people can't see themselves in those roles. So they take smaller steps until they can see themselves in the next step and the next step. And I think that's okay. I think God's very patient with us. I think God takes us where we are and doesn't leave us there and takes us a step further, but he helps us to take those steps where we can see ourselves moving forward. So I think there is always, that is not to say that every lay minister should become ordained, but I think it's a good starting point to help people see their place in ministry.
And I think what Katherine demonstrated there is the role of an incumbent, which is very, very difficult indeed, of drawing out, calling out the unlikely vocations. It's a real skill. But being asset-based, rather than worrying about the priests we haven't got, look for potential in unlikely places. We run a program called Empower in the Diocese of Blackburn, where we encourage our urban leaders to look out for those, our urban clergy to look out for those unlikely leaders. And they have a year of quite intentional formation, building up confidence, teaching theology in accessible ways, helping people to grow in their lives of prayer and as leaders. The target was to have 12 a year. We put about 30 a year through that program, and that's becoming a real vocations machine actually to priestly ordination. And it's because of this, encouraging people to look out for those unlikely priests that God is giving us that we so often miss.
I think the opposite side of the coin is that the path ought to be easier. I've always said that I don't think any of our Lord's apostles would have been able to get ordained in the Church of England. It's too difficult, and I think perhaps that needs looking at from the other end. I'm not saying make it easy, not anything like that, but I think the process needs looking at, perhaps modernising even. But Bishop, you know far more about that than I do. But I've worked with ordinands in our parish for many years, and I've always found that some of the hoops they have to jump through are either not necessary or just plain stupid.
Thank you so much for your time this evening, Bishop Philip, Katherine, John. It's been a really fruitful conversation. I know we've really scratched the surface of this conversation of planting in the Catholic tradition. There's much more to be said. I wonder if we may just to finish. I just invite you to each just very briefly reflect on what your hopes might be in the next decade for the way in which we'll see the Catholic tradition engage with questions of renewal and church planting, and then we'll call it a night. But John, I wonder if you could start. What are your hopes for how this conversation might develop?
Which I picked up, is that the Catholic end of the church, if I use those phrase, both traditional and liberal, gets confidence in what they're doing, rather than thinking very often as a sort of beleaguered minority who do strange things. They have the confidence to say, this is our way we preach the gospel, this works, come and join us, rather than, there is a lot of stuff, certainly over the previous years, of being the beleaguered minority, and I don't think we are, and we don't need to be, and we need to push ourselves forward as being a valid expression of the Church of England.
Thank you, John. Katherine.
Yeah, I think something about confidence, and as John said, to be confident in ourselves and confident in the God we proclaim, and also to see something of a more balanced view from the Central Church and from diocese around the fact that there is something to offer of Catholic evangelism. Yes. I really object to being told you Catholics don't really do evangelism, do you? Well, yes, we do.
Bishop who told me that once.
Well, yes, I've been told that quite recently too. But I think something about having the confidence that's born of others having confidence in what we're doing, and keeping to the faith that it is relevant and it is of God.
Yeah, thank you, Katherine. Bishop Philip.
I would love us to learn that things like evangelism, sharing faith, starting new congregations, planting churches, doesn't need to be someone else's language. That actually we're doing it, that we should claim it, that we should enjoy it, and motivated not by institutional survival, because who's interested in that? Motivated by God's kingdom, by the desire that people should know life in Jesus Christ and play a part in building the justice of his kingdom.
Thank you, Bishop Philip, and thanks to all of you. And thanks for those who've joined us this evening. I hope it's been an interesting conversation for you. Do please keep in contact and do come along to some of our other things coming up. Katherine, I wonder if you may, I wonder if you'd be willing to pray for us as we close this evening.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Father God, we give you thanks that you call us into your mission, that you ask us to draw others to you as we draw to you. We pray that you will bless our communities and bless our endeavours, that in all things we may see you at work. We look at the excitement that you offer to us of the fullness of life and join in with hope for the future of your church and hope for the future of you in the lives of your people, that our lives may be transformed by your life. Pray for this in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.